Welcome to this video about how to become an Appium desktop ninja. My name is Wim Selles. I'm a senior solutions architect at Sauce Labs, and today is one out of 6 videos where I'm going to explain you how to become that Appium desktop ninja. First of all, what I want you to learn is some theory and also some background about Appium, because I think we need to understand what we need to automate with Appium, but also a little bit about how Appium works. And when we know that, then we need to go to the next step. But because before we can start the automation, we first need to set up everything on our local machine. We need to configure an Android emulator or an iOS simulator. So that's what we're going to do in the second video. In the third video, we going to connect Appium desktop to that configured Android emulator and configured iOS simulator. We're also going to explore how Appium desktop works, and we're going to walk through the screens. In the fourth video, we're going to look on how to connect multiple versions or different versions of Appium to Appium desktop. And in the fifth session, we're going to look how to connect Appium desktop to a cloud service. In this case, we're going to look how you can connect Appium desktop to an Android emulator or an iOS simulator, or even to an Android or iOS real device. And when we've covered all these topics, we at least know how Appium desktop is working. And what I will then want to do is I want to focus on some hidden features within Appium desktop. And I think if we covered all those topics and all those 6 videos, I think you made the start of becoming that Appium desktop ninja. So before we're going to dive into the details, I said we're first going to look into some theory and also some background. So let's get back to school. And let's first start with some applications. The applications that if we're using Appium or if we're using Appium desktop, the applications we might need to automate. And I especially wanted to mention those applications because I want everybody to start on the same level. So first of all, if we look at applications, we've got different types of applications. And one of the most common applications is a native application. A native application has been written with iOS or Android SDKs. You're using XCUITest or Android Studio to build them. And they're basically the applications that you're currently using already on your OS, on your mobile phone or on your iPad or tablet. And what you can see here, this is the Swag Labs application from Sauce Labs. And just be aware, you cannot order real swag here. This is just a demo application. You can download it also, and I will share the link also in the comments. This application has been written with React Native, which is JavaScript, and JavaScript will be compiled through React Native to native components, iOS and Android components. And that also brings us to the second language we could use to build native applications, which is JavaScript. But you can also use a framework which is called NativeScript. You can use Xamarin, you can use Flutter. All those frameworks can be used to build native applications. Then the second application we can automate or we can use also on our mobile phone or on our tablet or iPad will be web applications. And web applications are built with HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and see them just as a normal website which you can open on a desktop with a Chrome browser or Safari or Firefox or whatever browser you want to use. But a mobile web application has responsiveness, as we call it. It can automatically adjust based on the screen size, and it can then show or hide certain features in your application. And a most common feature that will differ between a desktop application and a mobile web application is, for example, the menu bar. If you're take for example the Sauce Labs website. If you would go to saucelabs.com on your desktop browser, you will have a menu bar at the top. Easy for you on your desktop browser to go to a certain page. But if you would look at a mobile application, there's a functional difference between the menu, how to use the menu, in comparison to your desktop application. And as you can see here, for example, we've got a hamburger menu, and this is also what you will see on the SaaS Labs website. You open the hamburger menu and then you will get all the options. And that's one of the biggest functional differences between a desktop web application and a mobile web application. With responsiveness, you can show or hide certain features in your application. If you would then look at automating those web applications, then automating a mobile web application is not that different in comparison to automating this on a desktop. Because when you look at the locators are basically the same. The locator strategies you can use are basically the same. The selectors are also the same. The only biggest difference, as I mentioned before, is the functional flow. And then we've got a third app. And the third app will be a hybrid app. And you then might be wondering, okay, why do you mention native app, web app, and only now the hybrid app? Well, if you would look at a hybrid app is basically a native app, which will be kind of like a shell around a website. It holds native functionality and it holds a website. And just to make this more clear for you, this is basically what is happening in a hybrid application. You're using web content in a native application. You're using the native part of your application to communicate with a microphone, to communicate with GPS, to communicate with, for example, your camera. But the web application, the web part, which is called the web view in a hybrid application, can serve content from the application itself. It can easily serve HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But you can also use a remote server. And in the past, when I was working in a large bank in the Netherlands, we used the hybrid application as our banking app. And it was pretty easy for the bank to add new features, deploy them immediately to production, but also to fix issues, to release bug fixes, that kind of stuff. It was easier to do that with content on a remote server being hosted in the end in the hybrid application instead of using a native application. And just to give you an example, like I already said, content on a remote server can easily be added, can be rolled back, but if you look at a native application, if you push that to the App Store or to the Google Play Store, it will take some time for Apple or Google to review it. So you can have multiple versions in production. You might need to wait on certain versions to be deployed to production. Hybrid applications, especially in this case for the banking app, gave immediate option to release fixes. But then there's also a fourth application which we can automate. And this is something that not a lot of people think of, and that is the OS itself. We can use the OS with Appium to communicate between an application, for example our own application, and for example a browser. And let me get back also to an example from the Netherlands. If you would now use an e-commerce application and you would order something, you can also pay with your credit card or you can pay with your bank. And then there needs to be an integration between your application, your e-commerce application, and the banking application. And sometimes you also want to automate that. And with Appium, you can automate that. You can automate the interaction between two applications. So you also need to be able to automate the OS. And that is also something what we can see as an application to be automated. But enough about the applications that we have. Now let's take a look at Appium. And let's take a look at what Appium can do. And let's again start at the beginning. What is Appium? Well, Appium is an open source tool for automating the native application, which we mentioned, the mobile web, and also the hybrid application. But as you've seen in the previous slides, you also have the option to automate iOS mobile, Android mobile, even Tizen mobile, Mac applications, and Windows desktop applications. So it's a pretty powerful tool which will give you the option to automate almost everything. Appium runs on Node.js, so that's basically the biggest dependency you need to have when you're starting your automation. And I also get a lot of questions, well, what's the difference, for example, between the Appium open source tools and if we would look at the native frameworks, such as XCUITest and such as, for example, Espresso. Well, see it like this. If you're talking about Appium and automating an application with Appium, there are two things that you don't need to do. You don't need to have a specific build. You can just use the build that's basically going to production. Because Appium is going to automate your application from the outside. Meaning that you automate the application like your normal user, your end user, would use your application. If you would go and look at the native frameworks, then the native frameworks behave a little bit different, especially when you're talking about the automation. We're talking about the automation, they're basically automating it from the inside out. Native frameworks give you access to the source code of your application and give you the option to automate certain features within your application, certain components from the inside out. That also gives you an advantage in speed. But if you would compare it again with Appium, it doesn't give you the option to automate app interaction or even to automate certain features on the mobile platform itself. But now we know this about Appium, I want to go back even to 2012, when it all started. Because Appium started with Dan Kuehler and Jason Huggins. And I don't know if you ever heard this story. Dan even gave a presentation about it, so I will give a brief summary. In 2012, on the Selenium conference, they had the option to give lightning talks. And Dan had a great idea. He created something to automate an iOS application. So he wanted to give that lightning talk. He had some issues with connecting a screen to his laptop. And Jason was patient enough, but he almost said, stop, we're not going to do this. But then he gave the presentation and it was really awesome. A few months later, Jason Huggins, who's also the founder of Sauce Labs, got back to Dan and asked, can we open source the tool? And they sat together, they thought about it, and that was basically the beginning when Appium was born. And if we're talking about Appium, I think that we need to thank some people. First of all, Dan and Jason for creating this tool. But it's not only Dan and Jason we need to thank. Because, like we already saw in the previous slide, Appium is open source. And if we would also look at that, I think we need to thank the people who are investing their time, their company time or their private time in making Appium better. So what you see here is a list of all the contributors that I've found that have been actively participating in Appium in the last few months or even the last year. And if you're not on this list and you're also contributing to Appium, I'm sorry, you might see yourself in the other contributors, but being a contributor does not mean that you're contributing code. It could also be that you're a teacher, that you're helping other people using Appium, how to use it, how to set up the drivers. Maybe even see me now as a contributor by explaining you how Appium and Appium Desktop works. So I think we need to thank each other for making the product as powerful as it is now. And you can also see here that I added an icon U, because you can also be a contributor. And it doesn't mean that you need to contribute to code. You can even optimize, for example, the documentation if there's something that you think is not correct. You can open a pull request for that. And you can even ask the people if they can help you creating a pull request. But it's also for spreading the word. Then you're also a contributor. So this awesome tool, Appium, is being maintained by all these awesome people. Thank you. And also for the companies who are funding Appium with, for example, giving people the option to contribute to Appium. So thanks everybody who is working with Appium and contributing back to Appium. Now that I've done this, now that I've thanked everybody, I want to go back a little bit more to Appium and dive a little bit more into what Appium does. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you an example how the drivers within Appium are working based on a sample for iOS. And this one is based on the Appium Pro newsletter, the diagram that Jonathan Lips made there. I think it's a very easy and understandable diagram. And thanks also Jonathan for creating this. And basically what I want to do now is just to give you an overview of what your test script is doing until the point it will reach your application. It will reach the phone itself. So it all starts with a test script, and it doesn't matter if this has been written in Java or Python or whatsoever. Doesn't matter. Just think about a test script. That test script will use some library calls and communicate with the Appium client. And that Appium client will be in your framework. That Appium client will communicate through the JSON wire protocol or the W3C WebDriver protocol with an Appium server. And an Appium server is basically, like it's already saying, a server running, for example, on your machine, which can accept all the incoming calls. It will do nothing else than accept incoming calls, sending the calls to something else, and responding back to your client and to your test script. So see it as, it receives and sends calls. From the Appium server, and that's also what I wanted to mention. The Appium server can be hosted on your local machine. It can be hosted in a local grid or a remote grid, an internal grid in your company. But it could also be the Appium server which is hosted in, for example, SaaS Labs when you're using the SaaS Labs emulators, simulators, or real devices. So when our call to, for example, click on a button receipt into the Appium server, it will then send through an in-memory communication the click command to the XCUITest driver, which is also in the Appium server. And from there, it will use the JSON wire protocol and communicate with a WebDriver agent. And the WebDriver agent is the first part in the communication process, which is hosted on the phone. You can see it as a small application which is installed on an iOS device and can receive and also send requests from your server from the XCUITest driver to your phone and to your application and your REST platform. And that's also what it's going to do. It's going to use library calls, XCUITest library calls in this case, and going to communicate with your Apple device. It will communicate with the OS itself, or it will communicate with Safari, or it will communicate with the application. And then it will go back. It will go back from the device to XCUITest, WebDriver agent, the driver, server, client, and then into your script. And then you know if the click succeeded, or if you wanted to get the text to do an assertion. You can then verify if the assertion was correct, yes or no, based on the text that you would get back from the Appium driver. So now that we know this is only for iOS. And in the previous slide, you also saw that we have a lot of people contributing to Appium, because everybody also has its own expertise. And that expertise is going to be used in the next overview. Because as we mentioned, Appium can automate almost everything on your phone. And it also means that Appium and the Appium client needs to use a lot of drivers, which makes this process maybe very complex for you to understand. Or maybe not, but basically if we zoom into the things that we use a lot, and it's also especially within SaaS Labs, then you would see that we would have two drivers that can be used for iOS, one driver to be used for the native part of your native application, for the native part of your hybrid application, or a driver to communicate with Safari. Then you can also see that we have three drivers to communicate with Android. We've got two drivers to be able to communicate with the native part of your application, your OS, or the native part of your hybrid application. Or we have a driver that will be able to communicate with the web view or with the Chrome instance on your machine through the Chrome driver. So now that we know this, we've got all types of drivers. We know a little bit about the communication now from Appium. You now might be wondering, okay, how does Appium look like? Well, let's take a look at that. It just looks like this. Isn't it amazing? No, I don't think that this is the most, sexy part of Appium. Because basically what we're now seeing is just logs. All the communication between your script and between the device will be shown here in the Appium logs. There is no UI to this. You can only debug it through the logs itself. And this might be a little bit, how do you say it, challenging for a lot of people. So this is also something that the contributors to Appium recognized, and they thought, okay, let's add something extra. Let's add a graphical interface on top of Appium. And that's why they created Appium Desktop. And if we would look at Appium Desktop, first of all, again, you will get a server. A server where Appium is running inside Appium Desktop. So it's not that you need to install Appium separately. No, when you download Appium Desktop, and we will cover this in the third video, but when you download Appium Desktop, you will get Appium embedded into that application. It's the only thing you need to install, Appium Desktop. You will get that server and you will get the server logs. But I think the most awesome part of Appium Desktop is this. It will give you a graphical interface of what is happening with your application. You will have 3 screens inside of one. On the left you will have a screenshot of, for example, the OS. In the middle you will have the translated source about what can be found where in your application. And if you would select an element, then you would have all the selected element attributes on the right. And this is basically how Appium is also working. It can translate a view into source and it will give you back attributes, and those attributes can be used during your automation process. The only advantage now of Appium Desktop is that it's giving you the insights on how to use it. So now that we covered basically some theory, now that we covered about what the drivers can do, we covered a little bit about the history of Appium, the people who are contributing to Appium, and we also covered what Appium is. And in our next session, we're going to configure an Android and an iOS emulator and simulator on a local machine. Because it's nice to know what Appium and Appium Desktop can do, but if we're not able to run this on a local machine, we might have a challenge. So this will be covered in video 2. I hope you liked it, and I hope to see you again in video 2, where we're going to configure Android emulators and iOS simulators on a local machine.